Now when I talked to God, I knew he'd understand. He said, stick by me and I'll be your guiding hand. But don't ask me what I think of you. I might not give the answer that you want me to.
On a bitterly cold winter night in Munich, Germany in 1970, Peter Green slipped away to a party at a local spiritualist LSD cult. 3 days later, Mick Fleetwood and several crew members had to go retrieve him from their commune in the woods. Soon afterwards, he quit Fleetwood Mac, got rid of his possessions, grew his fingernails out so long he couldn't play guitar, and became a recluse, refusing calls from his former bandmates. That moment would become the first of several in a series of what can only be described as bizarre and unfortunate events that would derail the groundwork laid by 1960s Fleetwood Mac, eventually leading them to California in 1974. There, the remaining members of the gritty English blues group were on a collision course with a young, ambitious duo. A chance studio run-in would forever change all their lives, reinventing the sound and legacy of Fleetwood Mac. It's a remarkable story. We'll begin New Year's Eve 1974 at a humble apartment in Los Angeles. Lindsey, Buckingham, and Stevie Nicks are hanging out with a few friends, getting ready to ring in 1975, which they all agree has to be better than the year they've just made it through. Suddenly, an exuberant Keith Olsen walks in. "Hey, I've got some big news." They all stop and listen. "Fleetwood Mac wants you to join their band." Stevie sat there in shock, looking at Lindsey while he and their friends laughed. Keith would spend the rest of the night into the new year trying to convince him to give up Buckingham Nicks and join Fleetwood Mac. Give up everything we've been working on and hand it over to Fleetwood Mac? Why would I want to do that? Doesn't make sense. We're just starting to make headway. But it made perfect sense to Stevie, who had been waiting tables at Clementine's as a 1920s flapper girl to help pay their rent. They were flat broke, and at just 26, she was already exhausted. In order to keep the lights on and their old Toyota running, she did what she had to do. She later told Billboard she had no other choice. "We were playing 4 nights a week at Chuck's Steakhouse because Lindsey wanted to play original music, so I just went along with that." Stevie soon joins Keith in trying to convince Lindsey this is the right move. The back and forth went on into the next day when Stevie scraped together some change and headed over to Tower Records to pick up every Fleetwood Mac record they had. She listened to everything, while Lindsey reluctantly listened to some of the more popular songs he knew. She picked up on Peter Green's mystical presence and became convinced that this was a good idea. Lindsey let her in on his reservations. "Listen, Stevie, 100 effing people have been through Fleetwood Mac. It's a meat grinder." She fires back. "No, you listen to me. We're doing this. I'm tired of being an effing waitress." Lindsey finally picks up the phone and calls Mick, who invites them to a Mexican restaurant in the valley. They needed to see if their personalities were a match, and they were all a little nervous about how the two women would get along. Christine would have to approve before the deal was done. And with 2 couples in the group, what could possibly go wrong? They were all on their best behavior, and Christine's no-nonsense English manner quickly warmed to Stevie's sweet Texas charm. It was the old world meeting the new over tacos and margaritas. After laughing themselves into stitches through dinner, Mick leaned across the table and asked, "Well, do you want to join?" Lindsey smiled and answered confidently, yes. Lindsey and Stevie each received a salary of $200 per week. She affectionately describes the early days like this: "Lindsey and I were breaking up when Fleetwood Mac asked us to join. But when I got an apartment on Hollywood Boulevard, he moved back in with me. Things got better between us, and we were no longer fighting about money. We were going to work with these hysterically funny English people and making great music." They all met at Christine and John's apartment to show the material they each had. Christine sat at her electric keyboard and played some songs she was working on, including "Over My Head," "Sugar Daddy," and "Say That You Love Me."
I'm over my head.
Lindsey and Stevie played them their demo tapes of Monday Morning, Landslide, and Rhiannon.
Monday morning, you sure look fine. the landslide. Piano rings like a bell through the night, and wouldn't you love to love her?
There was an overwhelming feeling of delight with the new material, filling the room and their heads with possibility. They knew, without saying a word, they had stumbled upon something special. Several days later, they began rehearsing. Christine recalls the first time they played together. I started playing Say That You Love Me, and when I reached the chorus, they started singing with me. I heard this incredible sound, and I said to myself, is this me singing? I couldn't believe how great this three-voice harmony sounded. My skin turned to goose flesh, and I wondered just how long this feeling would last. Everything was coming together almost too perfectly. Stevie said, "How could you not be happy? You're going with a gorgeous man who sings like an angel. You're in a band that's already famous. Things were looking up." Then one day, Mick invited Lindsey and Stevie over to his house for dinner with his family. His wife Jenny would cook them a proper English shepherd's pie. The night was going off wonderfully as the two couples got to know each other over red wine while Mick's young daughters played on the floor nearby. Mick's wife Jenny was sisters with George Harrison's wife Patty, and they listened intently to her stories of the Beatles' heyday. Jenny kept quiet about George and Patty's recent split. While Jenny was putting the kids to bed, Mick told Lindsey and Stevie he needed to tell them about the band. He needed them to know the truth about the history of Fleetwood Mac. He moved in closer as if he was Gandalf the Great, with his eyes wide, to tell them a secret that only the chosen few got to hear. Nothing ordinary ever happens to Fleetwood Mac. He began his tale with his icon, Peter Green, who started the band, which he would only refer to as the Green God. He began, "One night after a gig in Munich, Germany, March 1970, the Green God was invited to a party at a mansion near the woods by a model named Ursula Obermeyer. Green and roadie Dennis Keene's wine was spiked by a large dose of LSD, or possibly they just took it. There's dissenting opinions on the matter. But either way, Green began jamming in the basement with several people at the party. Dennis the roadie described the music that night. This kind of freaky electronic droning noise. It wasn't music as I knew it. Peter himself later said of the moment, "I'd got my guitar, so we played around with some music for a while. I had a good play there. It was great. Someone recorded it. They gave me a tape. There were people playing along, a few of us just fooling around, and yeah, it was great. Then I sat around and thought about everything. I was thinking so fast. I couldn't believe how fast I was thinking, and I kind of ran out of thoughts. I must have been thinking for a solid hour just sitting down on my mattress. And when we played the next night's gig, I felt marvelous, kind of fresh, not grubby. And when we jammed, I couldn't believe what I was coming out with. I played things I didn't know I could play, and the notes seemed to be going all around the room." Mick continues, "Nonetheless, from that point on, the Green God was never the same. Some say he was abducted, others say he stayed on his own. But John and I had to go get him from Munich's jet-set hippies in a commune called High Fish. After we returned home from Germany, he quit Fleetwood Mac, got rid of all his material possessions, grew his fingernails out as long as they would grow so he could no longer play the guitar, and refused any royalty checks. So much so that when they continued to send him checks for hits such as Black Magic Woman and Albatross, he showed up at the office where management was, threatening them with an air rifle. He was arrested and barely escaped prison time." Green remembered the incident a little differently, stating that he had returned from Canada needing money, and that during a telephone conversation with his accounts manager, he alluded to the fact that he had brought back a gun from his travels, leading the manager to jump to conclusions and call the police. Mick explains that he tried to contact Green, but he refused his calls. It was just the first of a series of devastating setbacks. We continued on, somewhat lost without Green, until John's wife Christine Perfect joined the band. She was an incredible blues singer with Chicken Shack. The following year in 1971, when we were in Los Angeles on a tour, a terrible earthquake shook the city to its core. We were supposed to play at Whiskey A Go-Go upon our arrival, but our guitarist, Jeremy Spencer, refused to go. He kept having terrible premonitions of doom and destruction. After we checked into the hotel in Hollywood, Jeremy said he wanted to go for a walk. He left and never returned. Several roadies searched all over for him, and 4 days later finally found him locked in a warehouse with a religious cult called the Children of God, who wore robes and took in runaway teens from the streets. Jeremy said he now went by Jonathan and refused to leave. He quit the band, left his wife and child who were back in England, and stayed with this cult from that point on. By this point, Lindsey and Stevie are sitting in disbelief at what they are hearing. But Mick isn't finished. He explains that when they get back to England, someone recommends American guitarist Bob Welch to replace Jeremy. He is a welcome new member and is credited for saving the band.
They were kind of saying, well, what are we really going to do, and have we been cursed, and is this the continual curse of the absconding guitar players? And is this new guy, I knew I was being scrutinized not so much for my musical talents, but for my psychological soundness, shall we say.
Back on the road, however, their guitarist Danny Kerwin begins having a mental breakdown, behaving erratically with violent outbursts. One night he smashes his guitar and then his own head into a toilet as blood splatters everywhere. He would become the first ever to be fired from Fleetwood Mac. During this tour, John and Christine are fighting at the hotel when one night he gets so mad he throws a woodworking owl at her as she ducks just in time for it to be stuck in the wall. Their marriage had been on shaky ground for a while when Christine finds solace in the sound guy and begins having an affair. Mick continues the story in a hushed voice. We still needed another guitarist, so we hired Bob Weston away from Long John Baldry in 1973. On one tour in the US, I brought Jenny along to keep me company. About halfway through, I discovered she was having an affair with the new guitarist. We were somewhere in the Midwest and had to stop the tour. I called our manager to break the news. He was infuriated. We headed back to England. The manager had to find another band to finish the tour, who were falsely told I would join them for some of the shows. Heartbroken, I left for Africa, leaving the band on hiatus for a year. Jenny called until I returned, and Bob Welch convinced us all to move to California for a fresh start. We could also avoid all the heavy taxes owed to the English government. Now we're in California. We haven't arranged for visas, immigration, working papers, or anything. But yet here we are, less than a year later, with hopes that things will turn around. Lindsey and Stevie drove home in a stone-cold daze. By the time they made it home from Mick's house, they can see a completely different picture than before. Stevie thought they needed Fleetwood Mac, but it turns out that Fleetwood Mac also needed them. Had they made the right decision? What did this all mean for them? Time would tell. Lindsey's initial reluctance about them being a meat grinder took on a whole new meaning. They head to Sound City to record their first album in February '75 and finish by June. Mick wanted them to go out on the road to promote the album and get audiences accustomed to the new members, but Warner Brothers refused to foot the bill, having little faith in the band after the previous tour disaster, so they would have to pay for it themselves, but Mick insisted it had to be done. They toured the country opening for bands such as Loggins and Messina, The Guess Who, and 10 Years After. It was a very rough tour, especially for Stevie, who couldn't fall asleep in cars, and her throat was a mess night after night. There would be an occasional bad review that would throw her into a dark hole. They started hiding all the papers from her. They would climb out of the car and into one college town after another. She was in complete disarray while her English bandmates seemed barely affected. Determined, she refused to give up. But they were being fueled by much more than motivation. By November, Over My Head reached the top 40. By the end of '75, their first album had sold over 1.5 million records. Mick's instincts were right on the money. Fleetwood Mac renegotiated their contract with Warner Brothers, who had just 10 months earlier taken out an ad for the band's tour, getting Stevie and Lindsey's gender-reversed names switched underneath their photos. Now, however, it was a completely different story. Stevie called the year magical, remembering, "I started 1975 as a waitress, and by the end of the year, Lindsey and I were millionaires." The cursed early years seemed to be a distant memory. Or were they? On their first tour, Lindsey, who was very protective of Stevie, couldn't help but notice every time he looked over at Mick, he was fixated on her as she twirled around and sang, leaving the crowd spellbound. One night, he invited Mick to his room for a smoke after rehearsal. Mick had given it up, but decided to be a polite guest and accepted the offer. After sitting in silence, out of their heads, Lindsey puts Mick on the spot. "You're having an affair with Stevie, aren't you?" Mick sat there in shock. He felt like he barely knew her at this point. Where was this all coming from? Oh no, was Lindsey going mad like the others? Maybe the curse wasn't broken after all. Mick sat and stared at the floor, too stoned to respond. They both sat there for a while, not saying anything, until finally Mick got up and left. It was never mentioned again. However, Lindsey's instincts weren't so far off. Years later, after Stevie and Lindsey were broken up during a Rolling Stone cover shoot, Stevie crawled into the bed and Mick had her giggling throughout the day. She admittedly fell for him. The affair lasted throughout their tour before they both came to their senses. By the end of the decade, every couple in the story would end up with a broken heart, relationships shattered beyond repair, and heated fights that fueled their music. But oh, what a wicked cauldron of incredible music they conjured up.
Absolute friend. None of us were spared. I wasn't spared. The only thing I was spared, I didn't have to confront my ex every day. Jenny, my ex-wife, mother of my two lovely daughters. So I was spared that. Needless to say, one of my best friends hooked up with Jenny for a while, so that sort of shook me a bit. So we were all... The band became, amazingly enough, the catalyst that got us all through that in a weird, sick fashion. And there was never a moment of giving up. We were all very much ensconced in what we were doing and committed.
In July 2020, an announcement. It's with great sadness that the family of Peter Green announced his death this weekend, peacefully in his sleep. Then 2 years later, November 2022, another statement. We would like everyone to keep Christine in their hearts and remember the life of an incredible human being and revered musician who was loved universally. Looking back, it all sounds like a strange dream. It all brings to mind something someone long ago once wrote. We are such stuff as dreams are made on, and our little life is rounded with a sleep.
I can't help about the shape I'm in. I can't sing, I ain't pretty, and my legs are thin. But don't ask me what I think of you. I might not give the answer that you want me to.